We are in the presence of being itself, upon whom we depend for the fact that we be. That this being is tri-personal, the foundational being that Jesus tells us to call our Father. The expressive being who is the Word of God, God's Son, and our brother. Dynamic, inspirational being that is the gift of the Spirit. Let us then say, glory to the Father,
and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as was in the beginning, is now, and will be, forever.
St. John Baptist del Sal.
Pray for us.
Live Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
Somebody said when Brother Augustine drew this thing on the board that he was still teaching biology. I also have a comment to make about music. We'll see if he shows up. Hey. You already did. That's part of what I said. Somebody said when you drew that thing, they thought you were still teaching biology. We just had a spiritual prayer, but there was no music in it today because music isn't always so spiritual. There's all kinds of music. It's spiritual or abstract anyway if you're listening to Greek modes or Johann Sebastian Bach. But I think we often use music as a comparison with the sacraments when you talk about the sacraments not only being signs of grace but communicating grace. Well, music can do that to you too, huh? And program music especially. So music can have a calming effect, or it can have an exciting effect. It can have an erotic effect. You can't say it's terribly spiritual if you listen to, for example, the orgasm that you hear in Tristan and Isolde, or in Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, where you have the male and female themes going at one another equal. It's more and more intense all the time. Or to say nothing of what's done with drums and rhythms and things like that and so on. So maybe Bland had a point. End of music lesson. We have an awful lot to do today, and I'd really like to try to do as much as I can to fill out background on this, but it's difficult to keep the facts straight and the commentary and the background to have adequate room for all of that. So I really do have to presume through all of this that you have read the material that I asked you to read. The factual stuff is all fairly well developed in the formative years, a good part of it coming straight out of our rows, with additions, as I said. And while we're on that subject, lest I forget, at the end of the session today, to remind you of what lies ahead. You've had if you've done what you were supposed to do for today, you've already had a fairly good sampling of what it's like to read Blanc. You really had only 30 pages of it to do for today. If you will look, please, at the reading assignments just for a moment to remind yourselves that although a weekend is coming up, from one point of view, it might be a good thing if it keeps on raining. Because for Monday, you're responsible for about 150 pages in Blanc. For Tuesday, only 25. But for Wednesday, there's another 100. And for an hour that we'll be meeting on Thursday, another 150. So if you had a little trouble plowing through those 30 pages that I asked you to read for today, imagine what it's going to be like getting 150 together for Monday. And it would be, you should read them. I think you'll see as we go along that you'll get a whole lot more out of what we're able to do here in the session if you have actually read this stuff. And some of it will take and highlight a little bit and all of that. There are whole areas that we have to cover this morning that Blanc says almost nothing, or about which he says nothing, or almost nothing. And the same with the other biographers. But once we begin to get into the foundation of the Institute and the problems that De La Salle is facing, personal and with authorities and so on, Blanc will kind of be our guide to lead us through all of that, and we'll be a lot closer to the text. So this past week has been untypical of what's going to happen next week. So just a word of warning in advance about that. Okay. Now, I didn't think we could quite finish this yesterday at the end, so I saved it for today. Maybe we should have gotten it out of the way, but anyway, it gets his whole education all together in one place. So we left him with his Master of Arts at the end of yesterday's lecture. And so he moves from the Collège des Bons Enfants to enter the School of Theology at the University of Reims. Now, I guess most of you are aware that in European language, they don't speak of schools of theology or of medicine. The term that's used in European universities, this is called the Faculty of Theology. All right, we usually mean when we talk about the faculty, we usually refer to the professors. But if you're reading in this type of a context, the Faculty of Theology would be the School of Theology, the theological program that he enters centered in the University of Reims. Another thing you have to realize, too, in European universities, the university isn't just one building or even a set of buildings. It can involve various, be located in various centers all throughout a particular town, as, for example, in Oxford. Well, one of the interesting things about this business of De La Salle enters the School of Theology at Reims, and that is not mentioned in the biographer. If you remember what you were supposed to read in Blanc for today, he says, oh, well, now he's such a pious young thing and all that sort of stuff, and he's finished his Master of Arts, and he was looking around for the most intense, most wonderful, most severe seminary, etc., etc., and without doubt they picked the holiest thing ever going, which is Saint-Sulpice. By the way, it should be mentioned that Blanc himself was a product of Saint-Sulpice, and he was always, all his life, influenced by what he studied at Saint-Sulpice much later than the founder. He was there in 1693. And all of Blanc's connections were with his fellow Sulpicians, including the bishop in the diocese where he started, and when the bishop was moved to Rouen later on, as we'll see, he brought Blanc with him. So Blanc is very strongly pro-Sulpician, and that comes through here. But he gets awful mixed up. For example, he says that, well, we'll come to that later. But anyway, so Blanc has the founder going straight to Saint-Sulpice. The fact of the matter is that he started in Reims. Now why? Well, it's obvious. It was his hometown. It was just easy. He was used to going to the university, to the Collège des Bons Enfants. The Faculty of Theology is right next door, right on the same street. The building where the professors lived is still there. You can see the room where Daniel Egan lived, facing out on the street, and so on and so forth. So that was one reason. But there was another reason. Already in the spring of 1669, while De La Salle was finishing up his philosophy studies, Daniel Egan and the Archbishop of Rouen, who at that time was Cardinal Barberini, appointed as the chancellor of the university a man with the strange name of Louis Éléonore Tristan. And Tristan did not have anything more than a bachelor's degree in theology. So there was a big fight between the faculty and the administration. between the professors, led by Daniel Egan. So Egan protested this, and he said, how could a chancellor who has only a bachelor's degree in theology preside over the examinations for degrees higher than the one he has himself, the licentiate and the doctorate? So they issued a big protest and, in effect, initiated a suit against the archbishop and the university authorities. Now, the presidial court, of whom, on which sat the founder's father and the founder's grandfather, this came to the presidial court, but the presidial court had the responsibility for protecting the privileges of the chancellor of the university, so it was already a loaded case. So it would look strange indeed if Louis de La Salle sent his eldest son to a different faculty, to Paris, to study theology. It would almost be a betrayal of the quality of what was going on at Saint-Sulpice, what was going on at Reims. So that probably would be another reason that motivated the father to send his son to take these courses. So he took his first year of theology in this troubled climate. Now, this problem continued all through the whole year. They calmed it down once the school year started. They were able to get underway for a while, but it flared up again, as we'll see. So meanwhile, John Baptist de La Salle begins his theological study. And for those who have been through the theological program, I must say, having been through it myself, the whole 4-year seminary course at Catholic University, the basic program is not all that different from what de La Salle went through. The philosophical preparation in the first place and the classical preparation, and then moving in, beginning with De Deo Uno, the treatise on the one God, and going on into the Trinity and so on. So we had these two professors. Michel de Blanzy was a rather wealthy fellow, kind of a pompous one too and all that, but a good theological scholar for the theology of the time, apparently. He clearly taught the course on the one God. We have certificates of assiduity. It's not exactly clear. There was also a course on sacred scripture course, but the title of the course was Scripture as Interpreted by the Fathers. We're still in the area immediately after Council of Trent, and a great deal of nervousness about Scripture. And you better not take Scripture on its own terms. You better study Scripture through the interpretations of the Fathers. The old Catholic approach against private interpretation. Well, of course, everybody. There's no way of doing Scripture except by interpretation and interpretation kind of thing. Well, that's another one. But anyway, so those are the courses that he's taking. Daniel Egan had the first course in the morning was at St. Patrick's. That was the name of the seminary, Saint Patrice. That was the name of the building. But then the afternoon course, where Daniel Egan had, we're not exactly sure what it was. It was called a prelexio. It might have had some attempt to bring the theology into practice, or extended commentary, or discussion. It's hard to tell. We don't know exactly what that was. But that took place after lunch at St. Denis. If you want to take a quick look at the map again. The Abbey of St. Denis, that's both St. Patrick's, the building of St. Patrick's has pretty well been destroyed over the years, but St. Denis is still intact. Can you all locate the Collège des Bons Enfants where we were yesterday? Place Royale, go right along that street that comes right off it. You see the Collège des Bons Enfants, and St. Patrick is right next to it on the corner there. See that sort of an L-shaped thing right on the corner of that crooked street? That's where the that's where the St. Patrick, the theology faculty were. But now you come down that sort of circular street going left all the way, and you see the Rue St. Denis, and then you come to the Abbey of St. Denis, directly under the cathedral. And so they were running back and forth. Now, as we said, the distances aren't all that great. So they went there in the afternoon, probably to wake them up after lunch or give them a walk or something, and then they went back and had another course of the thing. So the theology, it was an introduction to theology. It was a typical first-year theology course. Nowadays in theology, they start with a thing called fundamental theology and ecclesiology. At this time, a separate treatise in theology on the theology of the church was non-existent. That didn't develop until relatively recently in theological studies as a theological category. was always considered as a continuation of the course on credit. Well, by the time January came along, the ecolatra of the diocese sued the university over this business of the rector and declared that all the examinations would be null and void. And so then this started up this whole imbroglio again over the chancellor of the university. So it wasn't clear at all what was going to happen, whether the students were taking exams and the chancellor presided and grades were given, they were all ranked and so on. Then all this was declared null and void and so on. So the whole thing was kind of in a mess, and it was still all before the court. So with this thing, as bad as it was, this probably led the father to say, well, it's all up in the air, and it's very problematic, and it's not even sure that the school will be able to continue. So they decided to send John Baptiste de La Salle to Paris. So as it turns out, in the long run, in a series of, it took another 2 or 3 years to resolve this thing, but needless to say, the faculty lost and the administration won, and Tristan was retained in his position as the chancellor of the university. After all, he had been appointed by the archbishop, and so there was powerful forces working against the faculty, as is almost always the case when there's a controversy between faculty and administrators. And now who's getting autobiographical? Well, anyway. But it is rather significant that De La Salle did start in Reims, and that the fact that all of the biographers pass over the fact. So now he goes to Paris, to the seminary. And he goes to the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. Now, of course, when we think of somebody today who studies for the priesthood, it's almost taken for granted that a person would go to the seminary, maybe the minor seminary first for high school, then to the major seminary for 2 years of philosophy and 4 years of theology, and somewhere in the course of the 4th year of theology, they would be ordained a priest. Well, but the seminary building, for example, is not necessarily attached to the theological school. For example, at Catholic University of Washington, when I was studying theology at the university, the seminarians, none of them lived at Catholic University. They all lived in houses around the neighborhood. The diocesan, those who were studying for the diocesan priesthood, much as De La Salle, lived in the Sulpician seminary, the Sulps we used to call them, the Sulp house, and the Sulpician seminary was the college, where the seminarians were resident, and that's where they got their spiritual formation, and then they came over to class to study theology along with the Franciscans, and not the Dominicans, they kept their own place, but the Atonement Friars and the TORs and 1 or 2 isolated Christian brothers who stood out like a sore thumb. The brother who followed me in theology at the university said, after his first week there, he said, "Now I know what a black man feels like when he comes into a totally white school for the first time." Because I was continually, being the first one to do this, I was continually embarrassed all the time by especially one very colorful professor, Joseph Clifford Fenton, the arch conservative of the law and a great friend of Cardinal Ottaviani at that time. But he had these funny expressions. He called us kids all the time. So he could be very embarrassing, because once in a while I asked questions. You weren't supposed to do that. And I sat up in front, and I'd be taking notes, and I did well in the exam. So old Joe Fenton said, "God, kids," he says, "look at that brother there. Now, he's in here because he loves sacred theology, you know." He says, "The rest of you are here just because you have to be." He was funny. He was very conservative. He said one time his great ambition in life, he had a thing on Maisie Ward. First of all, she was a woman. She was trying to say some theological things. So, and she, of course, was very fond of Cardinal Newman, who was a bête noire for Fenton also. So he said his great ambition in life was to see Maisie Ward burnt at the stake and the fire lit with an old copy of Commonweal. Well, he must be turning around his grave and what happened to theology since, and also what happened to me, one of his star pupils. Okay, so he goes to, so he's living, so De La Salle is living in the Sulpician seminary, and he's taking courses at the Sorbonne. So we'll take these things separately. We'll take the seminary experience first, and then we'll go at the theology because that continues afterwards. But this was not, he goes to the seminary at San Sulpice, and he's only a seminarian for 18 months. You may have noticed I made a point of that in here, that when we think of De La Salle as a seminarian, he was a commuting seminarian most of the time. Huh? But it was only during these 18 months in Paris that he actually lived in a seminary setting as he was pursuing the courses that were required for ordination. Most of the rest of it he had to do on a part-time basis after his parents died. So that's one interesting fact. Now a little bit about this Sulpician, because I think the Sulpician influence on De La Salle and on all the clergy at the time was very strong and very intense. It was a relatively young society. Right? Its founder was Jean-Jacques Ollier, who founded the society almost in a kind of a gradual process. He began by instituting a small seminary. He had been influenced by the spiritual movements that were started by Cardinal Bérulle and continued by Charles de Condren. Now, de Condren was the spiritual director of Ollier, so Ollier has a direct link back to Bérulle. And they felt that there was a need to reform the clergy, to try to make real spiritual people out of it. And that this was the whole problem, that the clergy all over France had gotten very worldly. They were much impressed by what Charles Borromeo had done in Italy and so on. So the whole movement was basically to try to set up a means for reforming the clergy. So little by little, Ollier began to see, well, after an intense and a very complicated spiritual journey of his own, which we can't go into, he finally saw that you can't do much with these old priests and so on. They're too set in their ways and so on. The place to start is the seminary. So he started a small seminary in Vaugirard, which at the time was a suburb of Paris. It's now part of the main city. And so he started a small seminary in Vaugirard, and when de Condren died in 1641. In 1646, he was made pastor of the parish of Saint Sulpice, which had existed for a long, long time. So he was made the pastor of this parish. So once he got established as the pastor in the parish, he brought the seminary there with him and began to form a society. Right? So Saint Sulpice can mean many things. It can mean the society. It means the parish, which was a long-standing parish in the city of Paris. It can mean the society, the Sulpicians, founded as a society with the specific mission of training candidates for the priesthood in an atmosphere that would be saturated with the most intense and most disciplined type of spirituality, really kind of monastic spirituality, and impregnated with the ideas of Bérulle and Condren and Ollier himself. Okay, so is that kind of clear? Then in addition to the Sulpicians themselves, they had a sort of an associate group with them that got to be known as the Petite Communauté. Archbishop Godet de Marais, who was a friend of De La Salle's and there with him, was a member of that group. And then eventually Boyan, this fellow here, founded another group for poor clerics that would be associated with this. So there were several groups in this complex, in this large center on the left bank in Paris. Now, the main thing here I think we'd like to stress is something about the spirituality of this group. Now, the first thing to say about it, I guess, is that it was extremely Christocentric. And, of course, we're familiar enough with the writings of the founder, I think, to see that influence and to see that it's very strong. But it's a Christocentrism of an interesting sort. one of the key words in this spirituality is mysteries. You'll notice how often in the meditations, for example, the founder speaks about, in this mystery we see Jesus doing this, that, or the other thing. And his method of mental prayer is suffused with that reference to events in the life of Jesus as mysteries. Everything is a mystery. Because the fundamental mystery is, for them, is the mystery of the incarnation. So it's Christocentric and it's incarnational. But incarnation, the aspect of the incarnation, however, for this type of spirituality is the idea of kenosis. That famous hymn of St. Paul in Philippians that we use in Holy Week. That Jesus being equal to God, did not consider being equal to God something to be boasted about, but he took on the form of a servant, this coming down, this descendants type of a thing, this abnegation, giving up his divine status. Now remember, we're in a society where status is everything, huh? And rank and nobility are very close. So for them, for the being who is God himself, equal to God, identified, to give up that godness or the God status and to come down, to absorb, to take part and to be part of this human nature is an act of absolute renunciation and abnegation. How low can you get? Huh? That reminds me of a joke too, which I better not tell it. But at any rate, this is the whole approach that if God himself could be so stupid almost, or so willing to give up everything to become human, to become one of us crumb buns, well, this even to be imprisoned in the womb of Mary, that's a very the Sulpicians had a very interesting devotion to Jesus in the womb of Mary. And that comes up in some of the founders' meditations every once in a while. And of course, in the Thomistic theology that they're inheriting, or the Christology, it was presumed that all his life long Jesus enjoyed the beatific vision. So that even when he was in the womb and in Bethlehem and so on and so forth, he could have spoken out any minute. He knew everything that was going on. He knew of the whole history of the world and all that, because it was a human perfection to know, and they just simply attributed to Jesus every possible human perfection from the first moment of his human existence in the womb of Mary. So, it's a great thing if a king or a lordly person would say hello to somebody or shake hands or acknowledge their presence and so on. But for God himself to actually come down and take on our human nature, this was considered abnegation in spades. So that's a fundamental, and so their spirituality is based on that. So the key word they use to express this whole business is anéantissement. You make yourself into a big nothing. And they can get very graphic about this. Comparing, we have a kind of a vulgar expression, this is a piece of shit. Well, they actually use that expression about themselves. Only worthy, ultimately the worms will get at you. So you are a big nothing. It was certainly not a way to form a basis for self-esteem. And I suppose in some of them it might have caused severe psychological trauma, depending on what their psychology, what stage of Erickson's development they were at the time. But at any rate, that could do something to you. But this certainly is now, and this is one of the reasons why Blatt is always interpreting what the founder does in terms of humility. And there's a bit, after all, since he knew the founder himself had been schooled in this business, the founder himself would certainly in his meditation, say to himself, well, if God could become man, if God could become human, why can't I become a subject to Brother Henri Leroux or somebody? So that's an important part of it. And this also leads, needless to say, to a tremendous emphasis on obedience. An absolute, literal, blind, submissive obedience in every last detail. And they were trained this way. And the seminary was run this way. And not only the students, but all the professors absorbed this type of mentality. It was a very strict and rigid seminary schedule and seminary routine. And of course, needless to say, the big thing that would interfere with this was worldliness. So separation from the world became a very, very important aspect of the thing too. Flight from the world and contrasting. See, because again, it was a reforming group. And the worldliness, they were as much conscious not only of the grosser vices and so on, but the general worldliness of the clergy at the time, the French clergy. And so they were very conscious of themselves as a sort of a yeast in the ecclesiastical society to get the true spirit of what it was to be a priest, and therefore to be able to, and to have this sense of their own nothingness, that everything therefore was going to be accomplished by God through them, but if they were going to do this, they had to be totally different and totally separated from the world and totally obedient to the directives of superiors and their own spiritual directives. And needless to say, if that attitude was there towards the world, it was also there towards the body. Now, I didn't, this is all developed at great length in our Rose's Cahier, and I picked some of it off here because I like to pick this type of thing. If you got this, did you read page 82? Did you notice some of that? Now, the influential spiritual leader of the seminary when De La Salle is there is Louis Transon. De Breton-Villiers was the successor of Ollier, and he was the superior general when De La Salle, and the rector of the seminary when De La Salle entered. He would have received him, but shortly after that he was succeeded by Louis Transon, who was the major influence in the seminary at the time. He was the principal spiritual director of the whole seminary and of some seminarians, possibly even he might have been De La Salle. But he gave all the conferences, and he wrote treatises. He wrote many, many treatises, all of which still exist. I've got some of them. For example, on page 81 here, I notice, in his treatise on obedience, Transon devotes an entire section composing 17 chapters to the topic of submission to regulations. So it's not surprising when the founder begins to write a rule that regulations, and very specific regulations, become very important. He pointed out how important was the seminary rule, the need to pay attention to the smallest details, rejecting all pretext for being excused. So, notice the paragraph below, separation from the world. When giving conferences to seminarians, Transon encouraged them to live in the world without being corrupted by it, just like the springs of fresh water in the sea that are not tainted either by its salt or its pollutants. Serve God as if the world contained nothing else but God and yourself. Michel Sauvage says that he has probably read the founder's treatise on mental prayer at least 50 times through in his life, and he says he still has difficulty getting through the first 20 pages or so. If you read the founder's treatise on mental prayer, the whole first section is devoted on that if you're going to be in touch with God, you have to get out of touch with creatures. That you have to totally dissociate yourself from anything creaturely in order to be able to get involved in the presence of God. Now, I don't think we would buy much of that today, but this is a type of spirituality. And so when you're in this climate in the 17th century, you have to kind of get a little feel for this type of thing, to see how they were thinking and to see how it contrasts with our own. But some of these actually I think get to be kind of funny in a way. So if you go to page 82 in the middle, the characteristic mistrust of the body and its functions is likewise evident in Transon's manual. Concerning eating, he says, this is a notably base, earthbound, and animal action where there is no difference between man and beast. He notes the danger of sins of intemperance in eating and drinking. The seminarians are urged to take their meals in a Christian manner, that is, by having. Now, see, this is where the mystery thing works out. You get soaked in the mystery of Christ, the fundamental mystery of the incarnation, which is abnegation at its root, But then you see that operating in Jesus in everything he does. So that everything that Jesus does is a mystery in that sense. Every single human action is a mystery rooted in the mystery of the incarnation. So they had to eat their meals in a Christian manner. That is, having before, during, and after the meal the dispositions of Jesus Christ. You had to put on that mind of Christ. Now, what were those dispositions? While you're eating, obedience, frugality, penance, modesty, and sacrifice. Bon appetit. Yes, that's often been remarked. Now see what he has to say about sleep. Concerning sleep, the manual describes it as the most earthbound, the most gross, the most animal-like of all our actions that we have to sleep. It is the last act of the day, and it's often the last act of our lives. In order to go to bed in a religious spirit, the seminarian should, this is a quote, consider the bed as a coffin, the bed coverings as a shroud, the body stretched out as a decaying corpse, without beauty, without life, and without movement. Have a good night's sleep. But of course, they were insistent, on the other hand, on the importance of learning, because he has that lovely quotation here, someplace, that learning without piety produces a proud cleric, piety without learning produces a useless one. I like that one. Spiritual directors, please don't. So that's, I think that's enough to get a handle on the basic spirituality. And now, it's easy to make fun of it, of course, but there's a fundamental reality that's here too. When the founder talks about seeing everything with the eyes of God, or having a Christological thing, this notion of identifying with the humanity of Jesus, who is the Word incarnate and so on, has something for it, and to be able to see that everything that Jesus does, and we can, if we want to get into an incarnational theology, then everything that we do in our humanness has a divine dimension. There's a mysterious aspect to it, an angle to it that doesn't meet the ordinary eye, but that can be seen only with the eye of faith. And that's the positive thing of this that I think we have to begin to realize. All right. Now, it's interesting, the student body were almost all wealthy. That's why one of the subdivisions, this one here, had to eventually say, well, we ought to be able to do something to give this type of quality seminary training to clerics who are too poor to be able to afford the high fees. So when Louis de La Salle sends his son down there, you can make sure that's put a major dent in the family budget. And the students there, at the time De La Salle was there, Rose has them all cataloged. He's got all the names and everything else. The records of the seminary were pretty well kept as to entry dates and all that. A tremendous number of them, of course, became bishops and so on. All of that's in the cahier, if you want to pursue it. But while he was there were two bishops. One of them was an Irishman. There were 7 of the students living in the seminary, most of them, a lot of them studying theology at the Sorbonne, the university. There were 2 bishops, 7 priests, 3 deacons, 4 subdeacons, and the rest were all in minor orders, including De La Salle, who's identified as a canon of the cathedral and an acolyte. So you were in very influential society, and so the alumni of Saint-Sulpice all around France, they maintained a good bit of networking, as we would say today, and Blas certainly was into that, and the founder was to some extent too, and could have been even more if he had pursued it, if his career had been different. The exercises, if you look at the schedule of exercises and the pattern of them, you would almost think that you begin to see very clearly where the founder got a good part of his rule. There was a long period of meditation in the morning, followed by Mass in the office. For those who were not yet subdeacons instead of the office, now those who were not bound to the office, said the rosary instead of the office, which is exactly what the brothers did. I think that's the origin of the rosary for the brothers. Instead of saying the office, we said the rosary, because we weren't bound to the office, and we're still not bound to the office, although in most places we say it. Long periods of meditation, morning and evening. spiritual conferences by the overall spiritual director, who would have been Tronson. But one of the major elements here was a spiritual director. Everybody was under a spiritual director, and all of their literature is just saturated with the tremendous importance of a spiritual director and following the direction of a spiritual director. It's not perfectly clear who was the founder spiritual director. In talking about his period at Saint-Sulpice, Blanc says it was Boin. This little thing here points out that that's a diphthong and this is another syllable. Boin. So he says it was Boin, but Boin didn't become a Sulpician until well after the founder was out of there. So it could not have been Boin. Boin was the founder's spiritual director later on when he was at Vaugirard, but that's a different period. Arose thinks Tronson himself was probably his spiritual director. Others think it may have been Claude de la Barmondière. Particular examen at noontime was a very, very important part of the daily schedule. And there was reading at meals, and recreation was taken after meals, and much according to the pattern of the Brothers thing, where the only pious topics could be discussed. Nothing like games or anything. So the concept of recreation was there, and the founder had experienced recreation, certainly, all the time he was in the seminary. So an awful lot of the structure of what became more, it was a pattern too of a lot of other religious congregations. This wasn't all original with them. Just a word about some of these people who were in the seminary at the time. Bertrand Villiers was the superior general at the time. He was succeeded by Tronson. I think I've already said enough about him. Another interesting thing about Tronson is when he got very sick one time in Paris, they got this famous Dutch doctor named Helvetius to take care of him. And so when the founder fell sick, that's how the founder got tied to Helvetius. He was recommended by the Sulpicians in Paris. De la Barmondière was an interesting fellow. Now, although most of the seminarians were studying for theological degrees at the university, at the Sorbonne, some of them got enough theology at Saint-Sulpice to be able to be ordained. And it seems that some of the professors there may have taught theology courses even for those who were going to the university as a sort of a supplemental course. So one of the theology teachers was this Claude de la Barmondière, who later on became pastor of Saint-Sulpice, Henry Baudrin. This Claude de la Barmondière is interesting because in the conflict over Gallicanism and the famous Gallican articles whereby supposedly the French church was exempt from papal authority, we'll see more about that maybe before the morning's over. He was a young priest, 30 years old, in 1663, when he wrote his dissertation. And he took the position that it would be a mortal sin to vote in favor of the Gallican articles that were prescribed by the king. Well, that kind of got him in trouble. He wrote, one of the things that was very much bruited around among the theologians at Saint-Sulpice in those days was papal infallibility. And in all the discussions of papal infallibility, those who supported papal infallibility were supporting the idea that the Pope was infallible in everything he did. It was a personal infallibility. It was a personal charism guaranteed by his office, the support of the Holy Spirit. And that was Barmondière's position. So an awful lot of the influence on the founder about that strong Roman orientation and almost attributing a kind of a magical correctness to papal utterances and so on was very much the theological position of people like Barmondière that he had encountered at the seminary. Henry Baudrin will meet both of these much later on because they're pastors in the parish when John Baptiste de La Salle goes there. Baudrin had an interesting death. He died a wonderful death. Talk about a happy death. He was having asthmatic problems and breathing problems and so on. So somebody recommended that, well, he might go to the wine presses where the steam from the grapes and so on, as they were heating them and all that, there were all these vapors there, and that if he inhaled those, it might be helpful for his health. So he went into this enclosed vault with all these vapors from the grapes coming up and so on and so forth, and he began to choke. And he tried there was no air in the place at all, and so he tried to grope his way, and he died on the way out the door. So he died of grape fumes. Fayun is interesting because he was originally born a Protestant, but his brother was a convert, and then his brother in turn converted him. So we'll see more of some of these people. And he's the one who started the catechetical program in the parish that the founder got involved in. So we'll meet a lot of these on the way as we go. Okay? Is that enough on anything on the self-issue? Yeah.
Not on sufficient directly, but I've often worried, about the dissertation of St. John Baptist de La Salle. Everybody who earns a doctorate, has a dissertation. So number one, does his dissertation exist? And number two, where would you go to see it if it did exist?
It doesn't exist. It didn't exist, and it wasn't required. But we'll come to that. Anything on St. Sulpice? I don't know fully the answer to that. I was very friendly with Father Ray Brown, though, at one time, and talked to him a little bit about this. And he told me that for all practical purposes, the Sulpicians in the United States have broken away from the parent body because practically nothing was left of it. And he told me at that time, this would have been about 10 years or so ago, that altogether they now number something like 120 or 150 in the United States. But they're a very vital outfit. And they have a tremendous influence still in the seminaries that they have, including Washington, Baltimore, and other places, and is producing scholars like Ray Brown and all that. And I've always thought that that's an interesting reflection on the business of the numbers problem, that we're facing. We think we can't operate. My God, we're down now to only 8,000 brothers all around the world, and maybe a good number of them not active. Well, you don't have to be so enormously large to be effective. That's all I know. I don't know if it's helpful. Lloyd?
We have 3 salts who come through Town Hall Sundays for us in the course of the week, and I get the impression that they're doing a real revitalization of their own cells, very, very small amount.
Yeah, and just the American group, though, apparently. I think that there's some truth to that. They've lost contact with this art.
They have a rather large seminary in Montreal,
Yeah.
connected with Notre Dame.
Oh, sure, the Grand Seminaire was,
Right.
wasn't it? Yeah, they had seminaries on. Of course, they lost a lot of men, too, as everybody else did, huh?
Yeah, sure.
And then, and it's the same old thing. They got into the legal side of all of this stuff, huh? I remember when I was going through theology, the diocesan seminarians over in the Self House sort of made fun of all of the little regulations they had. One of them, for example, was they were forbidden to tuck their shirts into their pants with their hands. They had a paddle that they had to use to tuck their shirts in, so they wouldn't feel their own backside if they lost it. So, there's a lot of that stuff gets a certain distrust of the body. All right, let's take a look now at the theological thing in Paris. So I guess we'll have to erase Gus's.
General question on meditation, Luke?
I don't know if I'll be able to answer it, but go ahead.
I have read in several sources that the greatest biography or autobiography of De La Salle is the 16 meditations for the time of retreat. And the rationale behind that is it reveals clearly his value system, and this should be a function of a biography or an autobiography. So the question is, do you think that's acceptable?
No. Well, I don't think of the meditations at the time of retreat as of course you should ask Brother Augustine that, because he's the one who translated them. But tonight.
Thank you, David.
Tonight, not this afternoon.
Pretty good there, Gus.
Let me ask you a question. If those meditations are so revelatory of his values, where is the community? Where is the value of the community, which was one of the most significant things in his life? You won't find anything on that. It's all dealing with speech.
Very true. Yeah.
That's why I said no. One of the reasons, and of course they're not personal either. I mean, they're reflective of the value of the values of the institute and the community, but his own personal, we wouldn't know anything about him if all we had were the meditations of the time of retreat. We know something about the institute and apostolic spirituality and all that sort of stuff, and the apostolic vision. Michel Sauvage has an interesting explanation of why there's nothing in those meditations about community, because he felt they were all brought together to figure out what they were doing in the apostolate, but the community was a reality that was living right there while they were making the retreat. It was the whole institute together. And so this was part of the reality that they were actually living during the course of the retreat. He didn't have to say anything about it. It was there.
Good.
Okay. Thank you. So, the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne was founded by a man whose name was Sorbonne in the 13th century, all right? Robert de Sorbonne, with just S-O-R-B-O-N, and then the institution gets a feminine suffix to it, and so it becomes a Sorbonne. Now, like Saint-Sulpice, Saint-Sulpice can be either the Sulpicians or the seminary or the parish, etc. The Sorbonne is first of all, it's a resident college in Paris. It's part of the university. Over the course of its history, it became the School of Theology for the University of Paris. So it's the School of Theology. The Sorbonne was also a resident for the resident students attending the Sorbonne. Now, of course, De La Salle was not a resident at the Sorbonne. He didn't live in the Sorbonne house. He lived with the Sulpicians, as we just saw. It also refers, there are two groups, one called the Society of the Sorbonne, composed of a select group with doctoral degrees from the Sorbonne that had sort of a control over the policy, and then another company of the Sorbonne of all graduates of the Sorbonne and teachers at the Sorbonne who were living in Paris. That met together from time to time. And those last two groups often joined together, and they were extremely powerful over all the theological issues going on in France. For all practical purposes, they had the support of the king in most things. Sometimes they opposed him, as we'll see. And so this was a very, very influential group. Of all of those, of course, John Baptist de La Salle only took the courses. He didn't live there. He never got a doctorate at the Sorbonne, never got a degree from the Sorbonne. He would just have been a second and third year seminary student. So that was the only connection he had with the Sorbonne. So if he had continued there and finished his degree, he would have had a doctorate from the Sorbonne, would undoubtedly have become one of the group that determines theological and ecclesiastical policy in France. But of course, as Blouin would say, God had other plans for him, or grace was working against nature and killed off his two parents. But so that's what the Sorbonne is. The courses and the professors. Well, De La Salle has he has a second year of theology in the Sorbonne. And he has and he gets about a little more than halfway through his third year of theology. Now, moving on from the treatise on God that he had started in, he follows the order, the courses followed the order of the Summa St. Thomas. So following the course on God, he now has a course on the Incarnation. His teacher was Desperries, and he has the course on the Trinity, and his teacher is Lestat. And then in the third theology, he takes courses in the sacraments. He has the sacraments in general, and it gets as far as baptism with Desperries. He missed Eucharist and penance, and he has a course on grace from Lestat. So these are two, as they were called, royal professors. Now all of the discussion of the courses and that business of certificates of assiduity and so on and so forth, it's all in here, and I presume, or I hope you've read it, and who his classmates were and who the professors were. I just think I'd like to skip over that and let you do that on yourself, because I'd like to get to some of the more substantial issues. But one of the things that's interesting about this, again, with this intense research that some of these scholars have been doing over the last few years, we have a pretty good idea of what the content of the courses were. Because one of the method of teaching the theology, of course, again, this hadn't changed much from the time I did the seminary theology, was simply that the professor would lecture. And he'd give these lectures, and the students would take notes. So it turns out that we have the notebooks from two of the courses. And sometimes the professor would register his outlines, and we have that from the course of Desperries on the Incarnation. It's not much help because the course simply followed the treatise in St. Thomas. But it's interesting to see, for example, what the course on grace amounted to. One of those who signed those certificates of assiduity, this fellow named Menck, took these notes on the course on grace, and Coutet found this in the library of Marseille. And so here's what the great course on grace would consist of. The definition and divisions of grace. Now, think of what you're reading in Blount when you hear this stuff. The states of nature, the necessity of grace against the Pelagians and the semi-Pelagians, the role of grace in conversion, the causes of grace, the efficient cause, the efficacy of grace, how to reconcile grace and free will, how to refute the errors of Bias, Jansenius, Luther, Calvin, by using Cardinal Cajetan, Cardinal Bellarmine, the popes, and the councils. Then the second part of the course was the heretics and the errors on divine grace. To do this by the different states of human nature, the infirmity of nature and the necessity of grace, the divisions of grace, the nature and essence of grace, and then a treatise on merit. And in one of the notes, the conclusion is, on all of these questions, Rome is right, and the only thing the Jansenists have to do is to submit. So the treatment of grace was heavily anti-Jansenistic. Desperries' course on the Incarnation is interesting from this point of view, because in the course he only, following the outline in St. Thomas, he talked about the fitness of the Incarnation and the manner of the union of the human and the divine in the Incarnation, but that's as far as he gets. And on Desperries' treatment of the Eucharist and penance and all of the problems associated with sin and frequent communion that were very much in the air, well, when he took Desperries' course on the sacraments, he never got to the Eucharist and penance, and that all of that Jansenistic business that was very much in the air at the time, he was not able, he wasn't there for those courses, and he had to fill it in as best he could. Now, so this raises the question of what were some of the key theological issues in the Sorbonne at the time de La Salle was there. So I'd like to expand a little bit to get us a little bit clarified on this issue of Jansenism and grace particularly, and some of the other doctrinal issues. So when we come back at 11 o'clock, it may turn into a kind of a theology lesson, if you don't mind. And then we'll get him out of Paris and back up to Reims again, I hope before the morning's over. And we'll do as much as we can. And it's a lot we have to cover this morning. Tell you one story about this business of maybe two stories. When I was doing the theology in Washington, well, I had one marvelous professor. I dedicate the book to him in part, Eugene Burke of Paulist, and he taught all of the doctrinal courses from an historical point of view before he did the systematic thing, and that's where I kind of got my own liking for theological history. But so he was sort of the Lestat of our thing. Our Desperiers was a man named Stan Grabowski, a priest from the Detroit diocese. And he's the only one that I had through all the theology who lectured in Latin all the time. And so the seminarians used to grouse like mad, but nobody paid much attention because he gave the same notes in the same course year after year after year, and they all had the mimeographed, huh? And so before the exam, everybody would bone up on them. The seminarians wouldn't dare cut class. They'd be reported back to Sub House, so the discipline on that was pretty strict. A lot of the religious did, of course. I didn't. I wanted to learn the stuff as much as I could from him. But he'd lecture along in Latin, and he sort of spoke with his eyes half closed, and he's just rattling along, no teaching method whatsoever. And so I did two dirty tricks. I used to ask him questions. Once in a while. And the fellow seminarian did too. His name was John Whalen, a priest. He became a priest in the Orby diocese, and for a while he was acting rector of Catholic University. And so the two of us were continually asking questions, because he would say things like, it's theologically certain that God directly created the human body. And I'd say, well, gee, Dr. Grabowski, the biology department teaches, the whole biology department presumes that physical, bodily evolution is a workable hypothesis. Well, it says in all the manuals say that this is theologically certain. I said that means the whole biology department is in theological error. Well, that's what it means, And so after a couple of questions, one day he got even with us. He said, well, Brother Sam and Brother that reminds me of another one. Brother Sam and Brother Whalen, he said, Father, Mr. Whalen. Now, the program calls for scholastic disputations, where you have to defend a scholastic thesis. And he says, it occurs to me we've neglected that requirement for the last couple of years. So he says, suppose we do that in the next 2 weeks. And Brother Sam, you may take one, and Mr. Whalen, you may do another one. Oh, God. So he gave us some where you had to set a thesis forth and defend it. This is what the founder was doing, he had to do for his. So I figured, okay, well, I'll get even with him. So I did the whole thing from the blackboard, gave a clear outline, told a couple of stories in between and everything else. And so the seminarians loved it. I said, you should teach this course. But the other thing was, one day he said, now, some are complaining about the fact that I speak in Latin all the time. So I would like to take a vote. I could give this course in English. All the other professors do, I know. I could arrange my conscience on that. So, but I'd like to have a vote. So we took a vote, and of course it was overwhelmingly that he should lecture in English. So he announced the vote, and he said, of course, I'm happy to see some still prefer the Latin. There was enough of that to give me some encouragement, but okay, we'll do English. Now, 2 weeks later, the seminarian, I was beginning to fall asleep, and the seminarian next to me woke me up. He says, hey, Luke, he says, Stan's lecturing in English. I said, of course he is. He's been doing that for the last 2 weeks. Where were you? He says, geez, I never even noticed the difference.
11 o'clock.